Hi, everyone. My name is Charles Jung, and on behalf of the California Asian Pacific American Bar Association, or Cal-APABA, welcome to today's session of the Perspectives on Allyship series. Today's topic is the case for repeal of Prop 209. When I asked my friend David Chiu whether he'd be open to speaking on the subject of allyship, he suggested that it'd be interesting to discuss not just police reform, but the ongoing discussion of the possibility of the repeal of Proposition 209. This is not always an easy topic for our community to discuss, but it is timely and important. I'm very pleased to introduce our expert panelists. Assemblymember David Chiu represents the 17th Assembly District, which encompasses eastern San Francisco. He has served as the Assembly's Assistant Speaker Pro Tem. David also serves as the chair of the California Asian Pacific Islander Legislative Caucus. During David's 5 years in the Assembly, he has authored 59 bills that were signed into law by the governor. And before that, David served as president of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, the first Asian American to hold that post. David also has served as the president of the Asian American Bar Association of the Greater Bay Area. Eva Paterson is the president of the Equal Justice Society, which works to transform the nation's consciousness on race through law, social science, and the arts. Before founding EJS, she served as the executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. She proudly self-describes as being admitted to UC Berkeley School of Law as a result of affirmative action. Eva worked on the campaign to stop the passage of Prop 209, and she also co-authored an amicus brief in Grutter versus Bollinger, in which the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the race-conscious admissions policy at the University of Michigan Law School. Today, she serves as a co-chair of the Opportunity for All Coalition that led the effort to pass ACA 5. She also co-chairs the ballot measure committee now working to pass the repeal of Prop 209 on the November ballot. Vincent Pan is the co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action. CA was founded in 1969 and is a leading progressive voice on issues of racial justice and social change. CAA leads Stop AAPI Hate, a website formed this year to document and address the rise in anti-Asian hate incidents as a result of the COVID pandemic. Along with Eva Paterson, Vin co-chairs the Opportunity for All Coalition, and he also co-chairs with Eva the ballot measure committee now working to repeal Prop 209. Lisa Mack is an attorney at Minami Tamaki, where she represents consumers and employees in individual and class actions. She graduated summa cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from UC San Diego and received her law degree from UC Hastings. Lisa is very active in the community, and she somehow finds time to serve on the board not only of ABA Greater Bay Area, but also of PILO, the Asian Pacific Islander Legal Outreach, and also Cal-APABA. So turning it over to Lisa.
Thanks, Charles, and thank you everyone for joining us today for a timely discussion about affirmative action and the repeal of Prop 209. If you have questions for our speakers as we go along, please type them into the chat box, and we'll try to answer some of them at the end of our program. We'll start by first hearing from Assemblymember David Chiu about the legislative history of Prop 209, the current update on ACA 5, and the upcoming ballot measure related to that, Proposition 16. Assemblymember Chiu.
Great. Thank you, Lisa, and really appreciate being invited onto this, in part as a former president of the Asian American Bar Association in the Bay Area. I was super excited a couple years ago when Charles Jung and your colleagues decided to bring all of the bar associations around the state within our API community together as a formal advisor to all of you. This is how we build influence. This is how we get a seat at the table, and it's so important to do what you are all doing. And also really appreciate this conversation about allyship. It could not be a more timely conversation at this moment. So I was asked to give a little bit of perspective of kind of the history of Prop 209, both politically as well as through the legislature and where we are today. So let me say that this story certainly started in the 1990s, which I would describe in California was a fairly dark set of chapters for communities of color. I should note that in addition to Proposition 209 that was passed in 1996, 2 years prior was really the first foray of state ballot measures demonizing communities of color with Proposition 187, which is a measure to essentially say immigrant communities, particularly undocumented families, you are not welcome in California. Governor Pete Wilson in 1994 had basically wanted to start his campaign for the United States presidency by moving forward this measure that basically said undocumented families cannot access schools or cannot access hospitals. And it passed in November 1994, which is coincidentally when I first met one of our great panelists, Eva Paterson, as a 3L intern working for Eva when she headed up the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. 2 years after Proposition 209, I'll just note, in 1998, California passed basically an English-only measure that said bilingual education should be phased out of California. So the time period was really a dark one for communities of color. So now let's talk about Prop 209. Prop 209 really was a wedge issue that conservative Republicans nationally came upon as a way to continue to drive a conversation around race and really use race baiting and racially wedged issues to drive conservative voters to support politicians like Governor Pete Wilson. And fortunately for them at the time, unfortunately for the rest of us, they found the ideal spokesperson on this issue in the name of one Ward Connerly, who was an African-American businessman who benefited from affirmative action in his life, who decided to move forward on this issue of Prop 209. And a little bit of context, I was a 26-year-old, freshly minted attorney, member of the California State Bar, working as Democratic counsel to the Senate Constitution Subcommittee in Washington, D.C. And I came on this issue before Prop 209 was placed on the ballot, or as Prop 209 was being placed on the ballot, when Ward Connerly and Governor Pete Wilson were invited by white Republican senators. I realized that is probably an oxymoron because at that time they were all Republican senators to Washington, D.C., to the Senate Judiciary Committee to basically unveil the national Republican agenda, which was to suggest a race-blind strategy, which on its face became the language of Prop 209, but really was a diabolical way of setting all the communities back. And Governor Wilson and Ward Connerly came to Washington, got a huge hero's welcome by the Republican Senate majority, and the campaign for Prop 209 in part was launched. For those of you who are not familiar, Prop 209 on its face sounds beautiful. The language says that thou shalt not discriminate on the basis of race or gender or color or national origin when it comes to public contracting, public employment, or public education. That is all of our aspiration. And Republicans at that time wrapped themselves in the language of Martin Luther King to say, this is the colorblind society that we want, but obviously it neglected to address the fact that ongoing discrimination, as well as centuries of a legacy of discrimination and racism, had led us to where we are today. So despite a heroic effort led by a whole lot of folks, including Eva Paterson, who you'll hear from in a moment, Proposition 54 passed. And 24 years later, we are now having a conversation about whether race should matter. Let me also just mention that a few years after Prop 209, Ward Connerly attempted yet again with another measure, Proposition 54, which would have, if it had passed, forbade the use of race when it comes to data collection. And that was a campaign that I actually just coincidentally was the online strategist for the statewide campaign. Eva was also part of it. I think Ben was part of it, who's also one of our panelists. We were at that point, we learned our lessons from what happened in 1996 and explained to the public that if we could not collect data around race, we would not be able to know if white women are dying of breast cancer more than others, or if Asian Americans are impacted with hepatitis B, or African Americans with sickle cell anemia, or Latinos with diabetes. And we were able, with facts, to actually convince Californians to not support the right-wing agenda that Ward Connerly and others were pushing. So fast forward to now 2012. My former state Senate colleague, Ed Hernandez, proposed what was then became known as SCA 5, it was the Senate Constitutional Amendment, to reform Proposition 209. It passed smoothly through the Senate, but one thing I'll mention, because this is an Asian American audience, is when it passed the Senate, there were certain pockets of conservative Asians around the state that reacted very sharply to that, and basically threatened recall campaigns against some of my former Asian American colleagues, which then created a very difficult conversation. SCA 5 ended up stalling in the legislature in 2014. This was before I was elected, but not before there were significant casualties. And I think it's fair to say it very much strained relations between Asian legislators, African American, Latino legislators, and others during that time period, because it was a very, very difficult conversation. So fast forward to earlier this year. My great colleague, Dr. Shirley Weber, who is the chair of the California Black Caucus, let a number of us know that she was hoping to move forward with a repeal of Prop 209. And I think it's fair to say within our caucus, our API caucus that I chair, there was significant nervousness, but also a really strong sense that this is the right thing to do and this is the right time to do it. Not just because there had been a 24-year history where things have not gotten better for communities of color, not just because if you look at contracting, Asian American contractors have been set back alongside so many contractors, $1 billion a year lost to women and minority-owned contractors, not just because of the fact that we have not seen Asian Americans who have been promoted in many sectors in public employment. We haven't seen the bilingual teachers that we want. We haven't seen bilingual police officers and others, not just because when it comes to public education, we haven't seen the benefits that Ward Connerly and his Republican allies had said were going to accrue because of this. But obviously at this moment in 2020, we're in a time where in a pandemic, in my city of San Francisco, half of all the folks who have died of COVID-19 have come out of the Asian American community. When it comes to the economic impact of this recession, you've seen Asian immigrants who have been set dramatically back because we don't have programs that are helping them. And we've also seen just intense and acute racism attacking our Asian community. My good friend Vin Pan, who's the head of the Chinese for Affirmative Action, will document the fact that we've had 2,100 incidents of hate that his organization and others have documented. This is a time when we know that structural racism matters and we need to move forward with this. Let me just close my opening comments by saying this. One, while this has been a difficult conversation, and I will just say I've received 11,000 emails opposing ACA 5 from folks around California on this topic, and I've received some very intense emails and social media threats. It is the right thing to do. And this is why over half of our API population, when surveys say we need to bring some version back of affirmative action, why 100 organizations and API leaders are supporting this. It's the right thing to do, but obviously this is a difficult conversation. And let me close with one analogy from my time as president of ABA. So in 2005, 2006, when I was heading up then the Asian American Bar Association here, we were the first ABA in the country to consider supporting marriage equality. which had also been a very difficult conversation within our community. Asian Americans did not support at the ballot the first ballot measure to ask voters to consider supporting marriage equality. And it came to our bar association to consider this, and we had a very heated debate internally, but we ultimately decided that it was the right thing to do, despite the politics around us in our community and beyond. And I'm proud to say now, many years later, that decision, which today sounds like a no-brainer, was a difficult decision then, and it's something that we were on the right side of history on. And my hope through this conversation is that for the folks who are watching this, that you as a leader of your Asian bar associations will consider asking your bars to support ACA 5 now, Prop 16, because this is the time. It's time for us to step up. It's time for us not just to do something that's good for our community, but because it's important for all of our communities of color to move forward. So with that, I'll turn it back to the moderator. Lisa.
Thank you, Assemblymember Chiu, for providing that legislative overview and for your leadership on this important issue. Now, I'd like us to move into a discussion about the effects of Prop 209. Since it passed in California in '96, what has been the impact of Prop 209 on Black communities, API communities, other communities of color, and on women in the areas specifically of public employment, public contracting, and education? Let's go to Vin first for your perspectives.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, I'd like to start by maybe just emphasizing that ultimately Prop 16 is about fighting discrimination and creating opportunity for all. And one of the important things that it does is that it allows us to name and address the reality that structural racism and systemic discrimination do exist in these areas that were addressed by Prop 209, namely public education, public employment, and public contracting in a whole myriad of ways. And so, just to lift up a few examples, we know that in the areas of public contracting, on an annual basis, businesses owned by women and people of color have lost out about $1 billion a year. And so that's, $24 billion a year over the course of the lifetime of Prop 209. And that's money that really has been siphoned away, not just from these businesses, but from the communities that are really important to making sure that all of California thrives. And that includes Asian American contractors as well. And studies have shown, for example, even in cities with high numbers of Asian businesses like San Francisco and Los Angeles, those businesses get a smaller share of government contracts than they do in places like Chicago or Atlanta, where there are strong affirmative action programs. In the area of public employment, one good example is to look at the teaching workforce. And so when you look at the teaching workforce, either at UC or CSU, still predominantly male faculty, that does not represent, obviously, either the student population or the population overall. And if you look at the K through 12 workforce in our public schools, about 2/3 of our students are students of color, but only about 1/3 of the teaching staff are people of color. And there's plenty of evidence to show that students do learn better when they have teachers from backgrounds that are similar to theirs. In public employment, first responders, health workers, David mentioned police officers, but there's a whole range of other opportunities. And in particular, we see the ceilings that affect people of color and women. And so in the leadership ranks and the positions of power, still much greater overrepresentation of men and in particular white men. In the realm of public education, where I think there's been a lot of focus, we know that right after the passage of Prop 209, we saw a dramatic decrease in both admissions and enrollment for underrepresented minority groups. And I think that there's also a lot of misinformation, and so I want to address it straight on. For some of the more conservative parts of the Asian American community, there is a focus on the more select schools. We know that because of the lawsuit at Harvard, and we know that in California, a lot of the attention is given to both UC Berkeley and to UCLA. But after Prop 209 passed, barring affirmative action did not help the admissions rates of Asian Americans. In fact, at those select campuses, the admission rates of Asian Americans went down. Okay. Now, when you look at the current student population of UC overall and at specific campuses, so many other things come into play, including the overall population and demographic changes in California, including the increase in the number of international students, including just the ability for more students from across the country and also across the state to apply because of online application processes. And so I think that there is this really important myth that we need to address, that somehow by removing discrimination against any group or all groups in college admissions, that necessarily harms Asian Americans, and it doesn't. And also that narrative hides the fact that we have so many underrepresented Asian American subgroups, and whether those are Southeast Asians or Pacific Islander communities, and that their stories aren't being lifted up in service of this very East Asian-centric narrative of the model minority. So many of these things have been issues for our community overall, and Prop 209 has essentially made them worse.
Thank you, Vin. Eva, I'd like to move to you now to hear your perspectives on this question.
Hi, I can't see you all out there, but I'm so delighted to have been invited to this event about allyship. I was a poli-sci history major at Northwestern, and I'm also old enough to remember the days when we had encyclopedias. This is before the internet and Wikipedia, and I always like to read things. And so in the last couple of weeks, somebody sent me an email about a woman in the 1860s who desegregated public transportation in New York City. We all always think of Rosa Parks in 1955, but this lady did it in the 1860s in New York City. So I was, following this and that, and they said that another woman had challenged it, and people were very positive about her involvement because her husband had been one of the Black troops in the United States colored troops that fought in the Civil War, the first Civil War. I think we're trying to be led into a second Civil War now by people who shall remain nameless, but that's another topic. So I started reading about the United States colored troops, and it was enslaved people fighting for their freedom. But I also read that Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans were part of the United States colored troops. And just the idea that our two communities were working together for freedom over 150 years ago made me very happy. So let's fast forward to the 1980s. In San Francisco, there was a move to have more equal opportunity in contracting. And so my organization was the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights at that time. And we worked with an organization called Asian Inc. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember that, but Harold Yee was one of the leaders of that. And Eddie Lau, who's still around, was involved in that. And Black, Latino, and Asian American people were working to get more contracts awarded to people of color in San Francisco. I remember being very moved by testimony by a woman named Sylvia Kwan, who was, and I think still is, an architect, saying that when she went before predominantly all white male panels to get bids, they kind of dismissed her because she was a woman and because she was Asian American. And that her testimony very much moved the city and county of San Francisco to have more equal opportunity in contracting. When Proposition 209 came about, along with some other bad Supreme Court decisions, particularly the Croson case out of the city of Richmond, which limited the ability of government to provide equal opportunity in contracting. I remember that City Attorney Dennis Herrera had a bunch of us in his office talking about the ramifications. There was a Chinese American woman whose husband had died and had left her the concrete business that he owned. Some of you may know her, but she said because of the lack of affirmative action and race consciousness, she was no longer getting contracts. So this is the kind of concrete ill effects that that Proposition 209 has brought to be. And Proposition 16 will remedy some of that. Vin has already pointed out the fact that we commissioned a study 5 years ago that said businesses owned by people of color and women have lost $1.1 billion a year think of what that money would have meant in the pockets of our communities. It was interesting, David, you brought up something that I hadn't thought about, and that's because I'm in my silo. But the fact that we can't deal with the need for bilingual teachers because of Proposition 209 is a very important factor and something that I need to think about as well. We've seen that in the age of COVID-19, overt racism is really harming our businesses. Before the shelter in place, we saw that businesses owned by Asian Americans were being victimized by racism, thinking that somehow they had something to do with the virus. And so people were losing business. We now learn that businesses owned by people of color are disproportionately being devastated by COVID-19. In my community, you may know something about the payroll protection plan, which was supposed to get money to businesses to make sure that they didn't have to lay people off. 90% of the proposals given to that program by Black folks were totally disallowed. In addition, the Trump administration stripped any goals and timetables for businesses of color from the trillions of dollars of COVID money that was put into the community. So that hurt all our communities, African Americans, it hurt Asian Americans as well. So we have seen employment opportunities limited because of 209. We were involved in a lawsuit against the San Francisco Fire Department. And the first people who brought the case, it was brought by Black people. We then brought in women, and then we thought, hey, we've got to bring in Asian Americans and Latinos as well. So this is when Ed Lee was at Asian Law Caucus, and he was co-counsel on the case. And one thing we found is that in San Francisco, there was not one Asian American officer in the fire department, not one. And even though the case was originally brought by Black people, we formed an alliance and said, that's ridiculous. And so we made sure that there were Asian American officers in the fire department. One kind of way that society has been able to desegregate is by voluntarily desegregating workforces. Because of Proposition 209, that cannot happen. So there are all kinds of ill effects that are on my community and your community as a result of 209. And I couldn't be happier that we're having this conversation today, because there could be a way that we fight each other on this, but we need to be unified to make things better for all of us.
Thank you, Eva. Just to follow up on your remarks and Vin's remarks, do you have any thoughts on the premise of Prop 209 when it was passed? The arguments that folks made to get it passed back in '96. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think David described it correctly. It really was a very cynical effort to turn civil rights upside down. And what I fear is happening again is that there are too many members of our Asian American community, and in particular our immigrant communities, who may fall for that. You know, I think we know that a so-called colorblind society, in terms of public policy, only makes us blind to the structural racism that exists and the systemic discrimination that exists against both women and people of color. So I think this is one of the challenges of Prop 16, to really get out there and explain to community that, you know, if you look at the groups that are lined up behind Prop 16 and Opportunity for All, it represents all the groups and organizations and leaders who have always fought for all of us. And when you look at the opposition, it's actually, in many cases, quite the opposite. And also that there's a lot of contradiction. You know, that there's a focus on really not opportunity for all, but maybe in just certain instances, a very self-interested perspective on this. So the idea of needing to address, you know, these barriers in different parts of society is something that I think even our opposition acknowledges, but they're very, very focused on only one part and not really, you know, even buying into, even though they're using the rhetoric, not buying into either equal opportunity for all communities, and certainly not equal opportunity for our communities in all areas of society.
Couple of points. I want to riff off what Vin said and David said. Playing race politics is always very effective. You mobilize the hostile white community and make people of color the enemy. And that was explicitly why Proposition 209 was placed on the ballot in 1996. Clinton had won the White House in 92. He partially won it because he got California's electoral votes. In 1993, Patrick Buchanan, who was a speechwriter for Nixon, said, "We've got to get California's electoral votes back. So we need to put something on the ballot that will mobilize what was then known as the angry white men." Then they became the Tea Party. Now they become MAGA. So nobody really cared much about affirmative action. Health, education, those things are much more important on the list of priorities for Californians. But race is always a good wedge. So what they did, and this was brilliant, is they field tested apparently 47 versions of the language. And what they did, and it was brilliant, the language tracked the language of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So many people, when they went in to vote, thought, oh, this is a pro-civil rights initiative. I worked against it for 3 years. When I went in to vote, I read it and I went, this sounds good. So if that's how I reacted, imagine how many people were misled. 55% of the Asian American community voted against 209. The last thing you need to know is this. The 209 was fronted as, we'll make sure that there's fairness in terms of who gets into the UCs. But a lot of the money behind Proposition 209 came from the Associated General Contractors. They were the people who now have the $1 billion a year in their pockets instead of us. The last thing I would say is that we're very worried about this case winding its way up the federal courts from Harvard, because I understand the feeling of Asian American parents who want to make sure their kids get a fair shake. I think, though, that this is being used as a tool to wipe out all race consciousness, which could be in contract, employment, and the like. So it's important to understand the political context. The last thing I'll say is that in 1980, the Federalist Society was formed. And their whole idea was to get very conservative people onto the federal bench to advance a conservative jurisprudence, which also resonates with or advances the idea of the elimination of race consciousness. I fear they have their 5 votes now. Kennedy was holding the line. He's gone. Kavanaugh is a true believer. So I just think it's important to understand that these initiatives don't arise just out of whole cloth. They're part of a larger political agenda.
Thank you, Eva. Now, moving to the present time, there's a lot that's been going on in the world, and I would like everyone's perspectives on how those recent current events, and you've touched on some of them already, but I'd like to have a fuller discussion about how recent events, including the current coronavirus pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, the racial reckoning that's happening across this country, how have those events affected the discussion and maybe the perspectives around Prop 209? Assemblymember Chiu, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I think it's fair, and I think we would all agree that in a post-COVID-19 pandemic, a post-recessionary, post-George Floyd world, all of the racial and structural inequities in our society have been laid bare. We've seen that in virtually every area of civic society. And I think we have seen the impact of systemic racism, not just against Black folks, but in particular against Asians, whether it be vandalism against Asian businesses because of COVID-19 racism, or the impact on immigrant communities of a virus and recession. And I think we all understand that the legacy of racism and ongoing discrimination that exists is something that we need to address. And we have to acknowledge that race matters. And in order to counter the historic legacy of race, we need to not have our hands tied by the decision of a quarter century ago around this. We have an entire new generation of Californians and voters who never had a chance to sort of weigh in on this question. If you're under the age of 42, you didn't have the opportunity to vote on whether Prop 209 ought to exist. And so part of what we're saying is, at this moment in 2020, let's grade ourselves. Let's all decide if we should continue this policy from 24 years ago that hasn't improved the situation, has actually made it worse? Or should we be able to reset the conversation and start over again? If Prop 16 passes, it doesn't immediately impact, or it doesn't establish any affirmative action programs. It simply says we can start to consider it. And at that point, every city, every county in the state, every school district, the UC system, they can start to think about what might make sense and help shape the path for us to move forward for what a truly colorblind society would look like, what a true society where everyone has an equal opportunity.
All right, we'll move to Eva for your thoughts on this.
The realm of the spiritual. Oh, am I unmiked? Okay. I believe there are higher forces at work here. And the reason I say that is this. We wanted a vote on ACA 5, which became Proposition 16, early this year. And for a number of reasons, it didn't happen. I was very upset. But as it turns out, thank God, the delay happened. The first thing that happened was we were at the Public Employment and Retirement Committee at the Assembly, and you had a Republican assemblyman basically saying, wow, this COVID-19 situation has really revealed problems in our society, and we need to all be in this together. So at the end of the day, we did not need his vote, but he voted for us. Then you had another Democratic assemblyman who had been reached out to by Assemblyperson Sawyer Jones, and he was so moved by what he had seen with the discrimination in terms of how the COVID situation was hitting people. And David, I didn't know that half the folks in San Francisco who had been affected or died were Asian Americans. I think that's why this gathering is important, because that's now part of my presentation as I go forward. But this gentleman was so moved by what he heard from Sawyer Jones about the needs of African Americans that he actually read from the Bible as a reason for reinstating affirmative action. The next thing that happened was that Mr. George Floyd, we saw him murdered and calling for his mother on television. I heard from people who have seen many assembly floor arguments that they've never heard something as elevated as the discussion and the comments that were coming, particularly from the legislators of color who were able to talk about their experiences. And so the death of Mr. George Floyd really took this to a whole different level. And I know for a fact that there were people who were going to vote no, but because of what's going on in the streets, ended up voting yes. One of the particularly impressive people, and we'd like to have him be a spokesperson for us, is Dr. Pan, who talked about the fact that there are no Asian American deans at any of the medical schools, and talked about the fact that there is a glass ceiling for Asian Americans. And so I think people are now looking at the realities of racism in America, and for the first time are being able to look at this. You may have seen a bit by Trevor Noah, who said COVID-19 is really why we paid attention to Mr. George Floyd. We're all at home. There's no distractions. You can't turn off the TV to watch a ball game. And so everybody saw in the morning that ridiculous woman, Amy Cooper, in Central Park, calling the police on a man who told her to put her dog on a leash. And then that very afternoon, we saw Mr. Floyd. So I think a lot of white people who have wanted to think we're post-racial, I don't see color, all that kind of nonsense, had the kind of blinders pulled off their eyes, and we can't go back. I mean, Mississippi took the Confederate battle flag off its flag. I mean, that was just like, what? I don't know how long this is going to last. Americans can get distracted pretty easily, but I think that I know that being able to have equal opportunity through what happens with Prop 16 will allow more wealth to be created for people of color, and more wealth in our hands helps chip away at structural racism. So I wrote a little piece saying we have to thank Mr. Floyd for Proposition 16. His little daughter said, "My dad has changed the world," and he absolutely has.
Thank you, Eva. My last question for the panel today, before we move into the Q&A portion of the program, is if Prop 209 is repealed and reversed, how do you think that would benefit women, different communities of color, as well as how these groups all relate to each other? Then let's start with you.
Well, I think, women, in particular white women, have historically been one of the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action. And in some cases, when we talk about the fact that women make 80 cents on the dollar to men, that women of color make even less, we do find that there's much more popular support for measures to address that. And I also have to say for Asian Americans, like the idea of race consciousness or affirmative action is something that's a part of our lives already, and whether we want more movies like Crazy Rich Asians, whether we want more Asian American judges, whether we want more Asian American partners in law firms or CEOs, that in fact Prop 209 is the outlier. California is only one of 8 states that has this particular type of ban. Affirmative action is already legal in the private sector. And so I think that in some ways, it just gets California's public sector back up to a good starting point. But I think even more fundamentally, it does change how we can relate to one another. And oftentimes what you see happen on issues of race and gender is an instinct just to compare who's doing better and who's doing worse, and not really helping people understand that our solutions are not zero sum. That liberty for one person does not mean taking away your freedom, that in fact our collective freedom is tied together. And so, part of the opportunity, whether it's discussing anti-Asian hate incidents, is to be able to explain to people that our collective goal, our common goal, is to undo and dismantle structural racism, the notions of white supremacy, and that benefits everybody. And that for men, that actually dismantling patriarchy and sort of the toxic masculinity that comes with that benefits all of us as well. And so, there are very specific policy benefits from something like Prop 16, but I think it also is about how we can reject this notion that the best way to deal with these types of problems is to stick our head in the sand and just say, oh, things need to be colorblind, things need to be gender blind.
Great, thank you. And Eva, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. You have a panel, I think, coming up called Anti-Black Racism. And when I saw that, I went, oh. But this is a conversation to be real. So I'm sure there are Asian American people who say weird stuff about my community. At the beginning of the fight for ACA 5, there was a Black buddy who I know who kept saying these weird things about Asian Americans. He said, they don't care about us. They're doing great. Why are they for affirmative action? I said, that's ridiculous. Knock it off. And so he kept saying little things, and I kept saying, stop it, stop it, stop it. So about a week ago, he sent me an email and he said, you were right about the Asian Americans. They really have had our back. So in battle, in the trenches, we see who are our friends and who are not our friends. And so the fact that so many Asian Americans have been stepping up on this and pushing back against the people who flooded the assembly calls with anti things about affirmative action, and saying people like me who got into UC Berkeley are unqualified and we never graduated and we never passed the bar, which is nonsense. So I think people are seeing that we are allies, and I've seen this one individual transformed since August. So I'll just put it at that personal level, and I think it has ramifications for both of our communities.
Lisa, I would answer the question by saying that if California decides that race needs to matter in how we address structural issues this November, this is the beginning of a conversation of how all of our communities get lifted, right? This is literally, it's not the end, it's the starting point, because we will have to, as I alluded to before, have conversations in every jurisdiction in California. And what does our school system look like? What does our public employment system look like? Our contracting system look like in a way that uplifts Asian American bilingual teachers and Asian American bilingual cops and Asian contractors and Asian businesses that have been victimized by COVID-19 racism. There is so much that we stand to gain, but one thing I want to just remind everyone, whether you support this or not, if it passes, knock on wood, we will get to finally have those conversations, and we need those conversations. And this is how we build the just society that I think we all want to see.
So we have about 15 minutes left, so I'd like to move us into the Q&A portion of the program. We have several questions from the audience, and I apologize in advance. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we will certainly try. The first question is from Deanna, who asked, what were some of the lessons learned in the campaign against 209 that can be used to support ACA 5? Eva?
We were naive and dumb. We ran a campaign and we had money for one commercial. And the commercial we ran was a burning cross and Ku Klux Klan hoods. And we said, if you're against affirmative action, you're in league with the Ku Klux Klan. Well, that made us feel really good. But what we've learned in subsequent years is that appealed to the base, the people who are already with you. But what you're trying to do is get to the persuadables. And you have to get to the persuadables to get them to be on your side. So David pointed out the argument that we used to fight Proposition 54, which stopped the collection of any data. The first argument we used is if you can't collect racial data, civil rights lawyers can't be for justice. White voters went, no, we don't care. The second argument was if you don't collect the data, the health of people of color will be hurt. The white voters went, we don't care. That was one of the days when I was ready to quit civil rights law because I thought, who am I living by? But then we had the argument that David talked about. If you don't collect data, the health of white people will be adversely affected. They went, oh my God, we have to vote for this. And so we then tried to find the whitest white person we could find. So we found Surgeon General C. Everett Koop, who basically did commercials saying, if you vote for this, white people, you will die. He didn't say it like that, but that was the import, and we won. So what we've learned, and Vin and I were on a call this morning, we've learned you have to have message discipline. You just can't say whatever you feel like. You need to figure out who your audiences are and craft messages for them. You don't want to be disingenuous, but saying if you're against affirmative action, you're with the Klan, that makes you feel good, but that's not going to win one vote.
I could add something that's unique or specific to the Asian American community about this. As Eva noted, Asian Americans did vote against Proposition 209. National and state polls show that Asian Americans do support affirmative action. And our internal polling as well shows that a healthy margin of Asian Americans will support Prop 16. But it's important to recognize that much of the opposition has been from the Asian American community. And so although it's true that the majority of Asian Americans do support affirmative action, it's also true that the majority of the visible opposition has been in the Asian American community. And so we collectively have a very important role to make sure that that does not become the main narrative. And the narrative that the opposition is pushing is really around select school admissions and how it impacts, Asian Americans. And really, we're talking East Asian and Chinese Americans. And so I think the broader API community must work very, very hard to communicate what's at stake, both in terms of public contracting, public employment, public education for all parts of our community and all communities, but even more fundamentally, the importance of this moment to be able to push back together against structural racism and systemic discrimination.
I'm going to add just two quick things to what Vin just said. In 1996, to Vin's point, we really didn't have faces and leadership from our community. We didn't have a lot of elected officials or executive directors or others stepping up. And for that matter, if you look at the number of Asian attorneys in 1996 compared to 2020, it's night and day. And so this is probably the moment where I encourage folks on this call, if you care about this, join us. Reach out to us because we could use you as surrogates in your respective communities. As Vin said, there are many segments of our API community for which this is a no-brainer. So I think in the Filipino community, in the Southeast Asian community, in the Pacific Islander community, and so on, there's not even a debate. But we could use your voices as well. In in other communities, particularly in the Chinese community, we are very much having this discussion. And I think it's important for those of us that have the education of the law books behind me to lend your voice to this effort. And then one other thing I'll say is this is also an effort that a lot of attorneys are organizing around the state, not just with philosophical and moral support, but financial support. So there are law firms that many of you work in where even Vin might be calling on you. And if you could be voices within your firm saying, hey, if we believe in these values of equal opportunity for all, we should lean into the fight, and we ask you to do that.
We have another question from Vincent, who asks, can you speak to how to approach conversations about the importance of supporting Prop 16 in an intergenerational context? In other words, with parents and elders who do not support?
I'm going to start answering this one because I might be having some of these conversations right as we speak. You know, it's important when talking to different generations. Everyone comes at this from a certain worldview. And I would say, for example, for many of us who are the first generation, the first people in our communities to ever become lawyers, we have a different perspective than, say, our immigrant parents or immigrant grandparents might have. When I talk to my parents and my parents' friends, I often will talk about the arc of history where we came from, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese American internment, the murder of Vincent Chin, sort of the struggle that the Chinese American community and Asian Americans have had over many, literally over a century, and how this is part of the story and the narrative of that struggle. Now, one thing I also like to highlight is I wouldn't be where I am today but for African American civil rights leaders moving forward things that allow me to become an attorney, that allowed me to be the first Asian American to represent Eastern San Francisco in the California State Legislature. Right now, our API caucus, we're at the highest numbers ever. We represent a lot of firsts, the first Filipino, the first South Asian, the first LGBTQ APIs. They wouldn't be, none of us would be where we are today, but for the gains made by Black civil rights leaders. I often like to say that I came to San Francisco to work for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights that Eva used to head up, an organization rooted in the African American community. And I think it's important for us to remember that and know that our struggles, we wouldn't be where we are today, but for these struggles are common, and that's why we need to move it forward. But one other thing I also like to mention to my parents when we have these debates is I would not be an elected official today but for a program that I was admitted to when I was 19 that encouraged students of color in the late 1980s to enter careers of public policy. But for a fellowship I got to do that, I wouldn't be where I am today. And if you look at a lot of us who are elected officials right now, many of us, we all benefited from these programs. So we have to continue to fight to make sure the next generation gets to benefit from similar public policies.
If I could just add, I think that, across all generations in our community, we know that discrimination is real. We experience it in our lives, and we should acknowledge that and to communicate that fighting discrimination cannot be a selective notion. That if we are to achieve real progress in our battle to create opportunity for all, it has to be for all. And I think that in order to accomplish that, we need programs that meet our specific community needs. Discrimination impacts different communities differently. Right now, for the Asian American community, we are experiencing a lot of COVID-19 related racism. And that's a specific challenge that warrants a specific solution that includes race-conscious programs and measures. If I could just add, I think that, of course, there's a historical context of how our community has benefited, and just the Immigration Act of 1965 that allowed more immigrants from Asia to be in this country, and on and on and on. So I think that, the key I would say to this question is that the approach and the conversation, be prepared to engage in a long conversation. This doesn't have to be just soundbite. Your families, but be committed to having the conversation over time and be persistent.
Okay, next we have a question from Olivia, and it's a two-part question. She asked, do you have any suggestions on how to respond to those who are concerned about the ability to use race as a factor that could potentially harm people of color / minorities in the future? And her part two comment is, I've heard of the hypothetical of ill will leaders who may use race as a factor in the future. I think that it wouldn't meet the strict scrutiny requirement that Grutter set forth, referencing the Grutter v. Bollinger Supreme Court case. Anyone want to take that on?
Well, I can address it very quickly first. There are many laws that federal laws that prevent active discrimination, right? And so, part of the trick of the other side is to say this is to legalize discrimination, and that's not true. And as lawyers, you all know that. And also, the way that race and gender can be used is also very limited as well. And so, the cases cited in terms of college admissions, this would just allow race and gender to be one of many factors, and only in cases where the need for diversity is made, right? So in some ways, like, we're asking for so little, right? But the other side is making it seem as if this is some radical this radical permission just to discriminate based on race and gender. And so I think this is, again, where lawyers in our community have a particular opportunity to help educate, right? Because of the, what Prop 16 does is not radical. It puts us in line with the private sector. It puts us in line with most other states. We have many ways to fight discrimination in terms of how it would be used in these, worst case hypotheticals.
One of the things that we want to do between now and December 17th, which is when this will go into effect, is to come up with some manuals for use by employers, educational institutions, and agencies that give out public contracts. For example, the case on point from the Supreme Court is a case called Croson versus the City of Richmond. And under the compelling state interest part of that analysis, you have to show that there's an underrepresentation of businesses of color getting contracts. And then under the narrowly tailored part of the constitutional analysis, you have to show that your program is narrowly tailored to correct the harm. So we will make sure that there will be guidance to institutions going forward so that people of color, white people, men are not harmed, because that's not what this is about. This is about equal opportunity. And right now, white men are overrepresented in a lot of different areas, and we just want there to be equal opportunity. So the intent of us in moving this forward is not to oppress people, but is to level the playing field and to make equal opportunity a reality.
So we are just about out of time, so I'd like to thank our speakers again for their engaging discussion on this timely and relevant topic. Thank you to everyone who tuned in live for today's program. If you'd like to rewatch this program or share it with others, or watch any of the other programs from this conference series that we've done in the past few weeks, the recordings will all be available on the Cal-APABA YouTube channel. And now I'll pass things back to Charles for some closing remarks.
Hi, thank you, Lisa and Eva, David, and Vin, all of our panelists today for the perspective and the thoughtful discussion. And we appreciate everyone out there for joining us. Our next session in the conference series is a workshop on Tuesday. It'll be presented by Rudir Krishtel on the topic of working with the anti-Black racism in our own community. That Tuesday session will be via Zoom, not YouTube. And again, Tuesday, July 7 from noon to 1:30. And to register for the session, you can go to tinyurl.com/APA allyship. But if you've already registered for the conference, no need to re-register, as we'll send you that link. So we hope that you'll join us on Tuesday, and thank you.